All right, welcome in everyone. Ready for a deep dive.
Absolutely. Let's dive in.
Today, we're doing something a little different. We're going to really immerse ourselves in a single source.
Oh, this is going to be good.
Yeah, we're talking about Senator Cory Booker's almost 13-hour Senate floor speech.
Wow, 13 hours. That's commitment.
Yeah, that's a serious commitment to making a point. And our goal today is to kind of extract the core concerns, the main arguments, the essence of what he was trying to convey over that marathon session.
It's like we're going on a little expedition.
Totally, a deep dive expedition.
Mm-hmm.
And what makes this even more interesting is the incredible variety of sources Senator Booker brought into his speech.
Oh, yeah. He wasn't just riffing.
Not at all. I mean, we're talking handwritten letters from his constituents in New Jersey, articles from everywhere, the Associated Press, the Atlantic, NBC News, Reuters, Axios.
He really did his homework.
It's clear he brought in all these different perspectives, not just his own. And then on top of that, he's quoting other senators, Supreme Court justices, from both sides, conservative and liberal, even a circuit court judge.
So it's a real tapestry of voices and viewpoints.
Exactly, a real tapestry.
Yeah.
And our job is to kind of pull out those threads, the ones that really stand out, the ones that represent the most pressing issues he was raising. And, over those 13 hours, a lot of his anxieties focused on the Trump administration's policies, the actions being taken, the direction things were heading.
Okay, yeah, I'm seeing that in the transcript.
Yeah, and there are a few big areas that he kept returning to. Immigration, the state of health care, especially Medicaid, and the Affordable Care Act, Social Security, whether that was safe, our foreign policy and alliances around the world, and then some really fundamental questions about how our government was functioning, like was due process being followed? What about the separation of powers, the use of emergency powers, that sort of thing.
Yeah, those are some pretty weighty topics.
Absolutely, and we're going to try to untangle them to make sense of them for you today. So let's dive in. We'll start with some pretty troubling examples from the world of immigration. What do you say?
All right, sounds good to me.
One of the first cases that really jumped out, at least for me, was that of Kilmar Abrego Garcia.
Oh, yeah, this one is rough.
Yeah, it really stuck with me. So you've got this father living in Maryland, and he'd actually been granted a form of protected legal status, it's called, withholding of removal.
Okay, withholding of removal, I'm making a note of that.
You got it. And it's a decision that an immigration judge makes when someone would face real danger, persecution, if they were sent back to their home country. In this case, we're talking about El Salvador.
Got it. So he's gone through the legal process. He's been granted this protection.
Right, exactly. And to make things even more complicated, he's married to a U.S. citizen. He's got a 5-year-old kid, a U.S. citizen who's disabled, and he had no criminal record here in the U.S. He's doing everything right.
Seems like it. And yet,
the Trump administration admitted they messed up. Deported him.
Oh, wow. So they acknowledge an error.
They called it an administrative error. Yeah. But here's the really messed up part. They then turned around and said, U.S. courts don't have the power to order him back from this prison in El Salvador. It's called Succat, and it has, let's just say it has a reputation.
Yeah, not a good one.
Not at all. And this is where things get really, twisty. They deported him, right? But on top of that, the government then claims he's dangerous, that he's a member of MS-13.
Whoa, hold on. But he had no criminal record.
Exactly. And get this, the local police, the ones who'd actually dealt with him, they didn't buy it either. He was never charged with anything related to gangs.
That's incredible. So they're deporting him based on, what, just suspicion?
Basically. And to make it even more confusing, Senator Booker pointed out that even inside ICE, people knew he had this protected status. But because of what they called an oversight, because he was listed as an alternate on the flight manifest, he ended up on that plane anyway.
It's like a comedy of errors, but with incredibly high stakes.
Exactly, with someone's life hanging in the balance. And this wasn't just a one-off either. Senator Booker talked about how these deportations to that Succat prison were happening to others too, including Venezuelans.
Venezuelans too. What was the justification there?
That's the thing, it was really murky. In some cases, it seemed like the only reason was that they had tattoos.
Wait, tattoos?
Yeah, he gave some examples that were just mind-blowing. A tattoo artist. I mean, come on. An aspiring pop musician with a hummingbird tattoo, a swim instructor with an autism awareness ribbon tattoo, a barber, a soccer player.
So they're basically equating tattoos with gang affiliation.
That seems to be the logic,
Yeah.
which is, I mean, it's just ridiculous.
It's incredibly flawed logic.
Totally. And these were described as benign tattoos, nothing threatening. And for most of these guys, there was zero criminal history, no evidence of any wrongdoing.
It's really unsettling. It makes you wonder about the criteria being used.
Totally. There's this one guy, Otto Suarez Tejo, the one with the hummingbird tattoo. His wife actually recognized him in a photo of detainees at Secot.
Oh, wow. She saw her husband in a photo like that.
Yeah, it was released by the Salvadoran president after a U.S. judge had already ordered a halt to these deportation flights. It's wild. And then Senator Booker brought up this really old law, the Alien Enemies Act of 1798.
Okay, 1798, that's going way back.
Way back. It basically says that in wartime, the president can detain or deport citizens of an enemy nation without a hearing or due process, even if they're here illegally.
So wartime powers being used when it's not wartime.
Exactly. And the last time this was really used was during World War II with the internment of Japanese, German, and Italian nationals.
Right. That's a dark chapter in our history. But even then,
Senator Booker pointed out, there was some kind of review process, these things called alien enemy hearing boards.
so some semblance of due process at least.
Exactly. And then he quotes this circuit court judge who was like, whoa, hold on. There are no regulations, no notice being given under how the Trump administration is using this act.
So even less due process than during an actual declared war.
It seems that way. And this is how those guys, the tattoo artist, the musician, the swim instructor, all of them were targeted, removed, sent to that prison, no charges, no hearing, nothing.
That's deeply concerning. It sounds like a real departure from our legal norms.
It is. It is.
Mhm.
And then the focus shifts to something even crazier. American citizens getting caught up in all of this immigration enforcement stuff.
American citizens, how does that even happen?
Right. Senator Booker shared some examples like Jonathan Gual, a U.S. citizen detained at a car wash in Philadelphia. A 20-year-old American kid in Utah detained just because he honked at immigration agents. A member of the Muskogee Apache Nation questioned in New Mexico about his status. A Trump voter, get this, handcuffed in Virginia.
Wow, that's a range of people. Clearly something's not right here.
Yeah, it goes beyond just anecdotes. He mentions this GAO report.
Right.
You know, the Government Accountability Office, they're like Congress's watchdog.
Right, making sure the government is working properly.
Exactly. And they found that during Trump's first term, immigration authorities asked to detain roughly 600 people who were likely U.S. citizens.
Likely, so they weren't even sure.
Yeah, and even worse, about 70 likely American citizens were actually deported.
70. That's a huge problem.
It's a massive problem. And then there's this story about Jasmine Mooney, a Canadian citizen with a valid U.S. work visa. She gets detained by ICE for 2 weeks, no explanation.
So even with the proper paperwork, she still gets detained?
Yeah, treated like a criminal, she said. Freezing cold cells, no information, transferred to a real jail. And then, despite having a valid visa, they hit her with a 5-year ban from entering the U.S.
It just seems so arbitrary.
It really does. And then there's this heartbreaking story. A 10-year-old U.S. citizen recovering from brain cancer, deported to Mexico with her undocumented parents and 4 American siblings.
Oh, that's awful. What happened there?
She was denied the medical treatment she needed, the treatment she needed to recover from brain cancer.
That's just inhumane. They denied a child medical care.
It happened at an immigration checkpoint. Even though they'd crossed there before with no issues, they even had doctor's letters explaining her condition. Just devastating.
It really makes you question the priorities here.
Yeah. And then there's this case in New Jersey. ICE agents raiding a small business, no warrant, and they detain this Puerto Rican military veteran, an American citizen, even after he shows them his ID. It's like, how does this keep happening?
That really makes you wonder.
Then, zooming out a bit, Senator Booker brings up the impact on our law enforcement resources in general. His argument is that this focus on immigration enforcement is taking federal agents away from other things, like national security threats, terrorism, drug smuggling, child abuse, the real serious stuff.
So it's a question of priorities and resource allocation.
Exactly. And he quotes this former Homeland Security official, this guy who used to be in charge of this stuff, and Senator Dick Durbin, both saying that this is a misguided diversion of resources, that it's actually making Americans less safe.
Yeah, if they're chasing down people with parking tickets instead of actual criminals.
Right. And it's not just law enforcement either. He talks about how this is affecting families, communities, even schools. There were reports of teachers and school administrators being told to let ICE agents onto school grounds.
Wow, that's a scary thought. Imagine being a kid in that situation.
I can't even imagine. And then there's the plan to end temporary protected status, TPS, for tons of people from places like Venezuela and Haiti. And this is despite the State Department saying those places are still dangerous.
It seems like a real contradiction.
It is. And then this one really got me. The Justice Department dropped a case against Southwest Key, this group that houses migrant children. And they did this despite allegations of sexual abuse and neglect at their facilities.
Wait, so they dropped a case involving child abuse?
That doesn't make sense. And then one last point on immigration. Senator Booker talks about how undocumented people who are victims of crimes, like sexual assault or robbery, might be too scared to go to the police because they're afraid of being turned over to ICE.
That's a chilling thought. Silence victims out of fear?
Exactly. And that's bad for everyone, right? Because crimes go unreported, perpetrators stay free. So that was a lot on immigration.
It was a lot to digest.
It was. But we've got more to cover. Let's shift gears and talk about healthcare.
All right, healthcare. What were the big concerns there?
Well, Senator Booker's was really worried about what would happen to Medicaid and healthcare in general if things continued the way they were going. He used the word catastrophic, so you know it's serious.
Yeah, catastrophic is not a word you use lightly.
Definitely not. And a big part of his worry was about potential cuts to Medicaid. He mentioned a figure, something like $880 billion in potential cuts, just massive reductions in funding.
And what would that mean for people who rely on Medicaid?
He said it would be devastating, especially for rural hospitals, trauma centers, and people with disabilities. Those are the folks who really depend on Medicaid.
I can see how that would be a huge problem.
It would be. And by this point, 40 states had actually expanded their Medicaid programs under the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. And it wasn't just Democrats pushing for this. A lot of Republican governors supported it too.
So it was a bipartisan effort to expand coverage.
Exactly. And a lot of those same governors were really worried about these potential cuts. Senator Booker explained how in some states there's this trigger mechanism. If the federal government cuts its share of Medicaid funding too much, it automatically ends Medicaid expansion in those states.
So it's like a domino effect.
Yeah, millions of people could lose coverage. And then he connects these potential cuts to something we've talked about before, those big tax cuts that mostly benefit the super wealthy.
Right. The idea that you're taking from the poor to give to the rich.
Exactly. And he also talked about how the Affordable Care Act was being undermined, made harder for people to sign up, that kind of thing. So, yeah, healthcare was a big area of concern. And speaking of programs under threat, let's talk about Social Security.
Okay, Social Security. Another essential program for a lot of folks.
Absolutely. Senator Booker was really worried about what he saw as a tax on Social Security. The idea of calling it a Ponzi scheme, that kind of rhetoric.
Yeah, that kind of language can really scare people, especially those who depend on those benefits.
Exactly. And he shared that he'd gotten tons of letters from his constituents in New Jersey, people who are really scared about what's going to happen to Social Security, whether it'll be there for them when they retire.
It's their lifeline, and they're worried it's going to be pulled out from under them.
Exactly. And again, he links this back to those tax breaks for the wealthy. It's like, are we putting the security of seniors at risk just to give more money to those who already have plenty?
It's a tough question to grapple with.
It is. He even told this story about a man in Minnesota who had to fight just to get his deceased wife's Social Security death benefits.
Bureaucracy at its worst, I imagine.
The worst. 3 days of fighting just to get what he was owed. It's heartbreaking. So we've covered immigration, healthcare, Social Security. Ready for another big one?
Hit me with it. What's next?
Foreign policy. Senator Booker had a lot to say about that, particularly about how the Trump administration was handling things on the world stage.
Okay, foreign policy, always a complex topic.
Right.
What were his main concerns?
He argued that the approach being taken was leaving our allies feeling abandoned and making our adversaries bolder.
So a sense of instability and uncertainty on the world stage.
Exactly. And he gives some pretty specific examples. The relationship with NATO allies was strained. Ukraine was being, in his words, thrown under the bus, while there was all this praise for Putin.
That's a pretty stark contrast.
It is. And at the same time, he points out that Zelensky, the leader of Ukraine, was being called a dictator. So you can see how our allies might be a little confused.
Yeah, mixed messages for sure. And what about the broader implications of this approach?
Senator Booker was worried that we were losing influence globally and that China was stepping right into that void. It's a pretty big deal,
Yeah.
Shifting the balance of power.
It's a huge geopolitical shift. And how did he connect that back to the concerns of everyday Americans?
He read this letter from a constituent whose daughter was working with U.S. AD, the U.S. Agency for International Development, they were doing work in places like Ukraine and Kenya, important stuff like climate change mitigation, health programs fighting AIDS and Ebola.
So vital programs on the ground making a real difference.
Exactly. And the letter talked about how this work was being disrupted, how people were losing their jobs, how China was investing in Africa while we were cutting back.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty powerful argument.
It is. It paints a picture of a changing world order. And anything else on the foreign policy front?
Yeah, he also mentioned the withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement, the TPP.
Mm-hmm.
He saw that as another example of this kind of like going it alone, isolationist approach.
Right, a retreat from global engagement. And on that note, let's shift gears one last time and talk about how our government is functioning, those big constitutional questions that Senator Booker kept bringing up.
This was a huge part of his speech, this idea that we need to be fighting for our constitutional principles, that there's this erosion of due process happening.
Yeah, due process, the idea that everyone is entitled to fair treatment under the law, that's fundamental.
Absolutely. And he talked about how due process was being eroded for immigrants, which we talked about earlier, but he was worried that this could spread, that American citizens could be next.
So a slippery slope argument that if we let it happen to some, it could happen to all.
Exactly. And then there's the use of emergency powers, like the Alien Insurrection Act, and this concern that the executive branch, the president, was taking power away from Congress, from the people's representatives.
That's a pretty serious accusation.
It is. And he doesn't hold back. He talks about a potential constitutional crisis, about a president who routinely lies and makes outrageous proposals. Strong words.
Definitely not mincing words there. Any other examples of this perceived overreach?
Yeah, he mentions the Associated Press being banned from the White House press room, trying to control the media.
That's a pretty clear attack on freedom of the press.
It is. And then there's this story about national security officials using a messaging app with disappearing messages to talk about potentially classified information.
Whoa, that sounds like a recipe for trouble.
It is. And no one in Congress seemed to be doing anything about it. And then there were the efforts to dismantle or weaken agencies like the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB, and the Department of Education.
So undermining institutions designed to protect consumers and promote education.
Exactly. But he does point out that the courts, even Republican-appointed judges, blocked some of these actions.
So the system of checks and balances working as intended.
To some extent, yeah. But he also mentions the increasing threats against judges, which is scary.
Yeah, trying to intimidate the judiciary is never a good sign.
Not at all. And speaking of people who deserve our protection, Senator Booker spends a lot of time talking about veterans. He was really concerned about potential cuts to the VA, to veterans programs.
Our veterans, they've sacrificed so much. We owe them a debt of gratitude.
Absolutely. And he tells this story about a veteran working for the National Park Service who gets this terrible performance review and just feels completely abandoned by his country. It's heartbreaking.
I can imagine. To serve your country and then feel forgotten, that's got to be tough.
It's got to be rough. And then he mentions this statistic, 83,000 potential cuts to the VA workforce. And he's worried about how this will affect services for female veterans in particular.
Female veterans, they often have unique needs that require specialized care.
Exactly. And he brings up this article from Axios that talked about how firings and changes in the White House were hurting veterans, like potentially laying off 20,000 HHS employees who work with veterans. There were even reports of some HHS staff being locked out of their offices.
So chaos and dysfunction trickling down and impacting those who rely on these services.
Exactly. And once again, he connects these potential cuts to those tax breaks for billionaires. It's a recurring theme, this idea that we're cutting services for those who need them most to benefit those who need them least.
It's a question of values, of what we prioritize as a society.
Absolutely. And Senator Booker brings a personal touch to this, too. He talks about how he interned at a VA hospital during the Vietnam War, how he saw firsthand the challenges veterans face.
So this isn't just an abstract issue for him, it's something he's seen up close.
Exactly. And he mentions Senator Maggie Hassan, how she's working hard on the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, focusing on the needs of women veterans. It's clear this is something he cares deeply about. And now for the last big theme, the one that kind of runs through everything else. Wealth and taxes.
All right, wealth and taxes. That's a hot-button issue for sure. What was Senator Booker's take?
Well, he kept coming back to this idea that the tax policies being pursued were disproportionately benefiting the super rich, people like Elon Musk, and that this was happening at the expense of programs that help everyone else, the working class, the vulnerable.
So a widening gap between the haves and the have-nots.
Exactly. And he points out the irony that they're increasing the national debt while claiming to be fiscally responsible.
It's a tricky argument to make that cutting taxes actually leads to more debt.
It is. But he makes a compelling case. And then he drops this bombshell, this story about Elon Musk calling Republican lawmakers and threatening to fund primary challenges against them if they didn't support the administration's agenda.
Wow, talk about using your wealth to influence policy.
Right. Whether it's true or not, it shows how much power money can have in politics.
Yeah.
And Senator Booker's main point is that while a few people at the very top might be doing great, everyone else is going to pay the price.
So a system rigged in favor of the wealthy.
That's how he sees it. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground, a lot of really heavy stuff. But what's the takeaway? What's the message?
Well, towards the end of his speech, Senator Booker keeps coming back to this idea of good trouble, of standing up for what's right, for American values.
Right, he's like, don't just sit there and take it, fight back.
Exactly. And he emphasizes that we're all connected, that when rights are denied to some, they're threatened for all of us.
That's a powerful point. And what's the call to action? What does he want people to do?
He talks about collective action, a chorus of convictions speaking out against these policies, these trends. He wants people to demand truthfulness, to make their voices heard, to hold their elected officials accountable.
It's a call to civic engagement, to active citizenship.
Exactly. And then he ends with this really powerful image, quoting Frederick Douglass, talking about Lincoln's inaugural address as a sacred effort. He's basically saying, this is a pivotal moment. We need to rise to the occasion.
Wow, that's a strong finish.
It is. So looking back on this whole journey, this deep dive into Senator Booker's marathon speech, what are the key takeaways? What do we need to remember?
Well, it's clear he was deeply concerned about a lot of things, especially immigration, healthcare, Social Security, the way our government was operating.
And a lot of his worries seem to stem from this idea that policies were being shaped to benefit the wealthy at the expense of everyone else.
Yeah, that was a constant thread. And it wasn't just abstract concerns. He brought in real people's stories, letters from his constituents, reports from journalists, the words of experts and officials. It was all very grounded, very real.
It was. And it shows how these issues affect everyone, from the most vulnerable to everyday Americans.
Exactly. So as we wrap up, we want to leave you with something to think about. What values, what principles do you hold dear? What do you think is at stake in all of this? And what are you willing to do to protect those values, those principles?
Because at the end of the day, it's about all of us. It's about the kind of country we want to live in, the kind of future we want to build.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged.
And keep fighting the good fight.